Okay, good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning of Friday 13th. I hope nobody is superstitious here at the panel. Now we would like to open the session titled Enhanced European Neighbourhood Policy. And I think that the previous session with the Vice President of the Commission just set the scene perfectly. My name is Věra Řiháčková. I have the pleasure and the honor to moderate this session. We have 4 distinguished speakers. Let me start with the lady. We have Barbara Lippert here, who is the Executive Board Director of Research at SVP in Berlin. We have also Vladimír Bilčík on my left-hand side, who is the head of EU program at the Research Center of the Slovak Foreign Policy Association. We have also Mr. Dworkin, who is the Senior Policy Fellow at European Council on Foreign Relations in London. And we have Mr. Marc Pierini, who is at the moment a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe, but he also is a former EU ambassador in MENA countries. So indeed, we are at the fluid moment on redefining the EU external policies at the moment. We are waiting for the new ENP review to be unveiled next week, if I'm correct, on November 18 or 19. But beyond that, there are also many generic changes to the other policies of the EU vis-à-vis the external affairs. So we are looking now into the redefinition of the approach towards democracy and human rights with the new action plan in place, but there is also at the more general level a talk about the EU global strategy, which was just launched by the High Representative for the EU foreign policy. And if I'm not mistaken, there is another panel which is dedicated to this issue later this afternoon. So many challenges which need to be addressed by the new ENP, which indeed is changing. From what we heard about the concept, the principle of differentiation will be deeply rooted in the upcoming policy, which brings another set of questions, of course. And we were also somehow told that the EU is from now going to pursue its own interest vis-à-vis the neighborhood. So what does it mean, and how we can look into the new or reviewed ENP vis-à-vis the challenges which the EU is currently facing? We have only 60 minutes for this panel, unfortunately, so I will start by giving floor to each of our excellent speakers for roughly 3 minutes to address some of the challenges, and then I think we will open the floor to your questions. So Barbara, please, if you may start.
Yeah, Vera, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for having me on this panel. First of all, a general remark. I don't think that we will have a new neighborhood policy coming up in the course of this ENP review. And I would like to start with reminding all of us of what ENP really is about. I think it was designed as a long-term policy to foster transformation in 16 member states, and there were not overly generous offers from the side, more or less standard offers from the side of the European Union, but they could have been crucial. It's about, as always, the opening of markets to foster mobility, people-to-people contacts, and also to inject some money into the countries. So this policy, this strategy, this concept met with a totally different world over time, which was conflict-ridden, which was full of crises, and this policy was not made as a policy for crisis management. And many of us researchers, I would say from the start, criticized that there is a total lack of any geostrategic foreign security policy component in that policy. So what we now need is, I think, to improve on these weaknesses. So I would say the general line would be more strategic clarity. What do we want to achieve? And you already pointed at basic interests of member states and the EU as a collective actor on the international scene. And we also have to do a bit more in strategic thinking to reach more stability, more prosperity, more security, and only with the Arab Spring, for example, the European Union took up the notion of freedom also as an element in this policy. So I think no real redefinition of ENP as we saw at the Riga summit. That was one of the questions. But here you see already a glimpse of more, let's say, strategic thinking, because this summit was from the side of the EU a clear commitment to stick to its policy, not to give it up in a moment when there is war in one of the Eastern Partnership countries, the Ukraine, when we see crises all around, and that the EU, with this ENP policy, wants to strengthen resilience, for example, in the Eastern Partnership countries. The EU is still quite ambivalent as far as, or refuses to go further as far as for the Eastern European countries any membership perspective is connected with this strategy. To my mind, that is of course controversial. This is prudent at the moment, but the EU must invest more in the bilateral relations, which are now in a stage of becoming more and more individualized, differentiated from country to country. So it's not only decoupling East and South, it is within these regions that we need a specific management and shaping of relations with all of these countries, and maybe later on we go more into the details, but that would, to my mind, be the general line of a clear political commitment, more investment into politically, but also probably in financial terms, and finding more, what we always say, creative solutions, in particular for the countries that aspire to get closer and closer to the European Union, like Moldova, Georgia, and the Ukraine. But we should not forget about the others, and I think my colleagues will turn more to the south. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for reminding us what the ENP really is and what can we somehow expect, despite the ambitions to include, for example, the security dimension into the reviewed policy. Now I would like to give floor to Vladimír to give us his initial thoughts on the issue. Please.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here, and of course it's always hard to follow up after such a wonderful speaker as Frans Timmermans with this panel, but I hope we can at least pick up on some of the thoughts. And what I liked from the initial speech was the positive vibe, which I think we lacked a bit yesterday. I found a number of the discussion exchanges yesterday not only defensive but also depressing to some extent, and I don't think we want to have a particularly depressing debate here about neighborhood policy. I'll just say at the start that I very much agree with where Barbara started in terms of outlining where the ENP was a number of years ago. But clearly the ENP was designed for not only the good times, but also for the times which we in the EU understand we can control. Now, at the moment, we are in a situation, there are very few things we are able to control or directly influence in our neighborhood. And clearly, things not only can go wrong, but they also will go wrong. And that's what we've learned in recent years. So we have a very nice template when it comes to how we want to approach the neighborhood. We have a framework. We perhaps haven't even a strategy which is laid out, but what we lack is a clear set of policies. How we go about moving this in practical terms in a context which has changed so fundamentally. So I think one idea is to think about the ENP review. The other idea is to think about more specific policy questions and policy issues. What is our Eastern policy? now, and what can it be to effectively engage the neighbors and at the same time engage Russia, which of course is our neighbor but is not part of the neighborhood policy, but is a neighbor which in many respects has a fundamental influence on what happens in our neighborhood. So I think we need to start talking about specific policy options which the EU can deliver and get beyond the general framework debate or strategy. And let me just give a few thoughts where I think we could and we do need to move ahead and be also a bit personal. I was in Moldova recently, a couple of weeks ago, and I think one of the things which we need to address when thinking large about the EMP is how can we manage not to lose the people in the EU's neighborhood. There used to be huge expectations in the EU's neighborhood about what the EU can deliver. And of course, when we look at the opinion polls across the board, be it Moldova recently, be it Georgia, for instance, which of course was very positive about the EU, and the public opinion is changing in some very strong ways in this respect. I think the EU idea is losing the people in the region. Now there is still a lot of positive things which the EU brings, particularly with young people. When you ask a group of young people in Moldova how many of those want to go and work in Russia once they finish their studies, nobody is keen, but of course everybody wants to have an opportunity to experience the EU and to experience the EU standards. So clearly there is an attraction here, but in terms of the political realm and the political scene, the EU is hardly an issue which is a matter of consensus, and which in today's debates in our neighborhood is being pitched as something which has failed to some extent on its promises and delivery. Now this is a problem largely of domestic politics in these countries, which are failing to deliver on their basic promises. But the EU card is played out domestically without a very strong EU presence or EU counter-narrative in terms of what we can offer and how we can be present. So I think not to lose the people, and maybe this will be my last point initially, the EU has to be much more present on the ground in the policy areas such as education, such as specific changes to the business environment, such as visibility when it comes to infrastructure, not only in the capitals but also in the regions of our neighbors. When you travel out of Chisinau or when you travel to eastern Ukraine today, the EU is not there. There are concentration of EU activities in the capitals, but not across these countries, and of course that makes any attempt to have a sustainable neighborhood policy, to have a sustainable specific policy deliveries when it comes to our neighbors, very difficult. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vladimír. Thank you especially for this point of losing the people and the affinity of the people towards the ideas. And I think one of the reasons might be also the fact that the EU was not able to somehow make sure that the reforms in these countries are somehow irreversible, even allowing for the backsliding in many cases. I'm talking in the same way as you, mostly about the eastern neighbors of the European Union. Now I would like to ask Mr. Dworkin to give us his thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we already know quite well how the contours of the new neighbourhood policy will look like. In my view, many elements of them are welcome. I think the diagnosis that Barbara Lippert gave about the failings of the old neighbourhood policy was one that I would share. I think in some fundamental ways the neighbourhood policy before was based on perhaps a picture of the neighbourhood which was becoming obsolete, a picture of the neighbourhood which was Europe's neighbourhood rather than a contested neighbourhood, a picture of a neighbourhood where all parties wanted to move towards Europe when the neighbourhood contains a wide variety of different countries with different aspirations and different orientations. a picture of a neighborhood where economic modernization and political reform were all progressing in a linear direction, which again, I think we don't see. So I think a lot of the changes are very welcome. And the review, when it's unveiled, I think will contain few surprises because it's already been fairly heavily trailed. So what to me is good about the new policy that we can expect to see, differentiation clearly makes sense, that we should deal with the countries at the stage that they're at, that we should have, as it were, roughly speaking, two tiers, one for those countries that are really ready for serious engagement with Europe, others where we want to pursue a more transactional relationship focused on certain specific areas, a sharper focus on areas of interest to Europe. It seems to make an enormous amount of sense that it shouldn't be not only a policy of transformation, but also a foreign policy more generally, albeit a postmodern foreign policy that looks at the internal constitution of the countries that we're dealing with. More flexibility, no one can argue with that. And finally, more ownership of our neighbors, the point being that we perhaps overestimated the degree to which we could drive change in these countries from outside. So that's all very welcome. However, I think there are a couple of, to me, a couple of risks attendant on this new policy, which I think we should watch quite closely as the policy is unveiled and then implemented to make sure that these dangers are avoided. And the first one, I think, is a danger which I will introduce with a caricature. And my caricature is this. In the southern neighborhood particularly, in the early years of the Barcelona process, I think there was a sense that the most important aspect of what needed to take place in these countries was economic. That is, the role of Europe was to promote economic modernization in the countries of the South. And many of them did indeed achieve impressive growth rates. That theory was somewhat exploded in the early months of 2011 when the Arab uprisings made it clear that the populations of these countries were not sharing in the proceeds of growth and that certain structural issues within the societies were leading to wide levels of discontent among their populations. After that, our focus shifted to political reform and democracy, and we were told essentially that these were all reformers, reforming in their own way, and that our aim was to accompany them through a reform process. I think that also, with the benefit of a few years' hindsight, looks somewhat optimistic. And now we see a neighborhood that is really a neighborhood in crisis. And to me, the danger is that we will substitute a third focus for these other two, which is the focus on security and stability. And of course, security and stability are immensely important, and this is to do with disorder, with refugees, with terrorism, and so on. But I think it would be a mistake to lose focus on the other issues, because to me these provide the context within which security and stability are going to be achieved. And if we take our eye off the economic and political situations in these countries, then we may find that what we're left with is a crisis management policy, and the idea of a kind of a more long-term policy is disappearing altogether. And I think, the crisis management element is inevitable at this point, but I think it can't be the only focus of our engagement with these countries. And that leads me to the final point, more ownership of our neighbors. Yes, it's true that you can't drive reform from outside, and yet I think we have to have some sense when we develop our picture of our interests, how these interests fit together, and how the connections between security, political reform, economic development are made, and what that means as far as the priorities that we think these countries should be working on. And I think it would be unfortunate if we simply fell back into a position of working with these countries on whatever they wanted to work with us. We have to have some sense. Of course, we can't drive change from outside, but we must approach them with a high degree of local knowledge and a high degree of awareness of the priorities from our viewpoint, and try to put that into the relationship as well. So, to me, those are the issues ahead, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you for sketching out some risks which the new approach can actually bring up more eloquently. Now I would like to turn to Marc to give us his thought and to bring us more to the southern neighborhood of the European Union.
Thank you very much. My first remark is that historically the EU foreign policy has been shaped more by external events or shocks rather than a debate, calm and composed debate in the Council or European Council. We're going to go back to enlargement to the UK, shaping the African policy. We can go back 26 years ago in this region, the first FAR program with Poland and Hungary, then shaping an entire policy for the next 14 years until enlargement, but also creating rebalancing within the EU with the Barcelona process 20 years ago. Then events sort of accelerated with especially 9/11. This is 2001, where the EU and the US started cooperating with dictators against terrorism, Ben Ali, Mubarak, Assad, etc. And that put the Barcelona process on its head, basically. Political Islam developed, the Arab Spring came, and the Islamic State came. So we're not only shaped but disturbed by external events, and these events are happening in a rapid succession now in our neighborhoods. The South is a lot more difficult to understand now than it was. EU values, quote unquote, are not a very strong pulling factor anymore. Not even accession is. You've heard Mr. Timmermans. He's been twice to Turkey in the past 2 months, not even 2 months, 6 weeks. And we're basically negotiating Turkey's cooperation on refugees at the price of forgetting about our rule of law principles. This is what it has stake in the next Turkey-EU summit in maybe a week or two. This means that we have in front of us two basic trends. We do have an enlargement policy. It's a bit shaky, but it's there. We do have an ENP review. We do have the global strategy. All that is fine. There'll be differentiation, etc., etc. There'll be a sort of east and south divide within the EU, not new. This is all fine. It will produce, at rhetorical level, good arguments, good papers, but don't expect much at operational level because the external factors are now going to be much more important, and also we're facing mostly unconventional challenges. For me, the first one is by far Islamic State, which is resilient, strong, well-financed, and expanding. Sinai, Libya, Boko Haram, etc. The second is Syria. Western Syria is not Syria, it's a Russian protectorate, we know that, for Syrian reasons, but also for a pure Russian reason. Refugee issues is the third one, where Mr. Timmermans didn't say that, but where basically the EU is reacting to a policy by a number of mafias. We are facing this year a business on mostly the Turkish-Greek Western Balkans route, but also on the Libyan-Italy route, which is about 2 to 2.5 billion euros, just in fees to the networks, to the traffickers. This is very difficult for any government, any institution like the EU, Frontex and what else, to resist. So that is a massive undertaking. And finally, a more conventional challenge is Russia. Russia is now building, as in the words of Admiral Ferguson, an arc of steel between the north of Norway and the eastern Mediterranean. This is a return of the Russian Navy. It is a very big commitment, financial commitment, and it's going to be a huge challenge. So my conclusion is that it's fine, we're going to have a global strategy, we're going to have an ENP review, but we also need to be prepared for facing more emergencies in a more rapid succession and in a less conventional fashion that we had before.
Thank you very much, Marc. Let's see if the ENP reviewed will make the EU more flexible in order to be able to cope with those challenges. So with that, I would like to open the floor now for your questions, because we have 25 minutes. Please, I think we will take, please, Vladimír here, and then the gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Vladimír Handel, Institute of International Relations. Two questions, one to Barbara. You talked about the strategic thinking, and again, Russia came up. Vlado mentioned, and now it was mentioned again. Germany was always engaging as far as Russia is concerned, really tried to involve Russia in all those projects. At the same time, ENP countries are the area of competition between the European Union and Russia. At least Russia perceives the ENP projects and also Eastern Partnership projects as actually a competition, normative political competition. So what is now German thinking about, or your thinking, perhaps personally, your thinking about the ways and chances of engaging with Russia in these areas? May Russia be interested? Are there ways how to open up some of the projects and involve Russia in cooperation? My question to Vlado is rather on Visegrad. You are also working on Visegrad, and Visegrad is with us throughout this conference. So what is your assessment of the performance of Visegrad countries, their cooperation on the ENP projects? Because that was one of the issues Visegrad always wanted to work on, Eastern Partnership and ENP. So where do we stand there? How is the record of Visegrad on this? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we will take the question from the back immediately.
Hello, Vít Beneš, also from the Institute of International Relations. I would like to challenge one of the assumptions that has been raised in your presentations, and I think Vlado made it, that the goal of the European neighbourhood policy should be to enhance the trust in the EU and the attractiveness of the EU. I don't think so. The ENP is about the transformation, and the goal of this transformation in the partner countries is to rebuild the trust in their own democratic institutions and the attractiveness of their own states. I really think that this is the challenge of the ENP, that the ENP should be really about the state building. That the problem we face is not some kind of lack of trust or attractiveness of the EU itself, but the lack of trust and lack of attractiveness of the democratic institutions in countries like Moldova, in countries like, Ukraine. That was the problem that was the cause of the Ukrainian crisis, the lack of trust in Ukrainian institutions.
Thank you. So we have the set of questions for Vladimír, but let me start from the left, from Marc, addressing the question on Russia.
Maybe the first question was to Barbara.
I think it was addressed to the whole panel, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Barbara, if you like. Yeah.
I have a try at Russia. Thank you for the question. I think that Germany's Russia policy, as far as I understand it, has really changed over the last 3-4 years. So the line of thinking is, after the annexation of Crimea, in particular, not anymore Russia first, and not anymore being engaged with Russia without, I wouldn't say it was without any principles before, but being quite permissive on it. So I think you can clearly see, and Germany tried also to shape the EU's policy vis-à-vis Russia, that there are three components. One is sanctions policy, that is very much in the foreground. It is also staying engaged in dialogue, so the diplomatic activities around the Minsk process, that is really a focus of Germany's policy. And the third is really to strengthen the resilience of the Ukraine as a sovereign state. And I would say, to put it very brief, that to a large extent today Germany's Russia policy is policy towards the Ukraine. So that is something which I think shows the extent to which there is now a change underway. And I have to say that talking to many officials who really try to find out where is some room for cooperation again, they are quite frustrated. So the whole idea of having some sort of modernization partnership and using economic cooperation as a path towards also some political change, I think this is not supported by reality. And we do not expect now that there are some spillovers from this kind of practical, interest-led transactional cooperation that would open, let's say, new chances to talk again, and that is at stake, about the principles of cooperation and security in Europe. And I guess that the German government will try also to use its presidency in the OSCE next year to, let's say, to sort out whether in this format it is easier to not to get into business again with Russia, but to talk again about principles of what we used to call a European security order, which is, of course, the one that is challenged and undermined by Russia's policy. So that is looking for formats, for fora, to talk about these principles again and try to link it to the three dimensions of the OSCE. But the clear message is now that it cannot be accepted what the way Russia thinks its neighborhood should look like. And there we have a clear sort of competition, and that is why I think the German position is to really fulfill the obligations the European Union has entered into with the association agreements, which clearly need a more political also dimension.
Thank you. Marc?
I would like to give an illustration of the Russian challenge to the EU and the West through the policy in Russia over the past 10 weeks only. Essentially, Russia went in for three reasons. One was to rescue Assad from the brink, because he was about to collapse in the middle between Latakia and Damascus. Second, and this is an alliance of 40 plus years, so it's not insignificant to Russia. Second was to establish a strong military presence in the Middle East, way beyond the case of Russia, with now a large air force base being built and a small naval facility transformed into a base. But it was, third, a statement that Russia is there to shape the world order. And this is in reaction to the UN Security Council resolution in Libya and the way in which Moscow considers that it was distorted by NATO with the intervention in Libya. And we can see that with the negotiation on Syrian transition, quote unquote. The pace is being set by Russia, not by the West. All of this is accompanied by military buildup by Russia, more submarine patrols in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, sending cruise missiles from the Caspian Sea against ISIL. Well, do you need cruise missiles against rebels? No, you don't. Establishing the best electronic warfare instruments that they have in the Eastern Mediterranean, you don't need that to fight ISIS or Nusra. So there is a much wider demonstration being made there with Russia as the current example. There was Crimea and Donbass before, still there.
Thank you. Anthony, do you have some comments?
The one point I think I'll pick up on is the point that was made by the speaker at the back about the importance of building institutions within these countries, the neighbourhood countries, that their own citizens can trust rather than the EU. And of course, that's right. The aim is to, that's part of the transformation policy, which is, still residually there, I think, within ENP. But I think there's also an element that, that Europe does represent a kind of a model to these countries. It's a particular political and social system. And therefore, I think it can't be completely separated. And I think that when there are problems within Europe, when Europe looks less attractive, when Europe behaves in a way that seems inconsistent with its values, then I think this does have some impact. So yes, we should get away from the idea that these countries are looking to Europe as their destination. But I think we should try and hang on to the degree of attractiveness in the system that we try to embody, and see that as to some degree an advertisement for the attractions of stability and prosperity that the rule of law can bring.
Thank you. Vladimír.
Thank you. A couple issues. I'll just pick up on this one. Of course, the goal of the EMP is not to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. The goal of the EMP is to help the neighbors look more like states and make them more workable and make them a bit more predictable and ultimately make them look more a bit like ourselves. And I think that does involve a certain element of continued attractiveness of what we do in the EU, both across the population in neighboring countries and of course with the political elite. And I think this is where we've been on the losing end of the story when we look across the neighborhood. And in that sense, I guess it also puts the EMP and also the EU Eastern policy in a certain perspective in terms of what kinds of expectations we can have from this policy and how far we are able to change things. And that's where I get to my initial point. This was built around the idea of good times and also continued progress, which would take up the template of the enlargement policy. I think now we are making a fundamental break with an enlargement template, and of course this policy will be based on a combination of crisis management, a combination of specific policy tools, but also certain more realistic expectations in terms of what we can do in a neighborhood, how far we can influence things. And of course, if we want to be effective, we need to have allies on the ground. And those allies have to be the forces that make change, because otherwise, yes, they can have an idea of certain institutions, but those institutions may not look like the institutions we would wish to have in our neighborhood for security or strategic reasons. And in that sense, I'm just pointing to the fact that the Soviet nostalgia in our neighborhood, Moldova, but also parts of other neighbors, including parts of Ukraine, is on the rise. And that, of course, should make us think about how we design our neighborhood, and particularly the neighborhood policy when it comes to the East. Now, the second point on Visegrad, which Láďa Handl asked about, and the Eastern Partnership or Eastern Neighborhood Policy, I think there are, again, certain levels to this. And as we heard yesterday from the ministers, and I think it's clear, Visegrad, when it comes to politics and policy making, is largely a platform for dialogue. We actually don't have many common Visegrad policies. or policy goals even. We may have some general strategic ideas of what we want to do, such as get into the European Union over 10 years ago, or we want to perhaps see the Western Balkans in the EU one day. And we kind of broadly agree that Ukraine should be a workable state, but that's the extent to which we get. When it comes to specific policy issues and how we go about it, particularly in recent years when it comes to crises in our neighborhood, of course, that's where we diverge. Russia sanctions are one example. So we shouldn't have overly strong expectations from Visegrad when it comes to common policy making, but it is good to have that dialogue and that platform, because of course we have various formats of the dialogue which also include our eastern neighbors, Visegrad plus Ukraine, Visegrad plus other neighbors in the east. And perhaps given the current situation and the crises in the south, which of course affect the Visegrad countries, we ought to think about enlarging the political dialogue and the scope for this also vis-à-vis the southern neighbors of the EU, which is a fairly new topic in this region altogether. But when it comes to coordination and kind of division of labor working within the template, say, of the neighborhood policy, the Eastern Partnership, that's where, again, I think the Visegrad is helpful, although we may not agree on Russia policy and Russia sanctions. We may take up a certain division of what individual Visegrad countries are going to do and pursue as specific policy projects, policy investments in changing things or fostering change in a place like Ukraine. We have that division of labor now. Slovakia is working on projects trying to foster energy efficiency. The Poles are working on public administration reform in Ukraine. The Hungarians have taken up security sector reform. So clearly the element of dialogue and coordination in specific areas is something where the Visegrad is an added value. And maybe the last point, after all, we are here thanks to the Visegrad Fund, which is the only institutional basis of the Visegrad Group. And I think this is where we generate perhaps a lot more connections with our neighborhood. And also a lot more ideas when it comes to projects like Think Visegrad, which brings together 8 think tanks from across the Visegrad countries, which work on specific policy challenges when it comes to also neighborhood policy, and have these flying experts programs, bringing in experts from Ukraine, Georgia, other countries. I think this is all very important, and this is where you see kind of hands-on things. Whilst we haven't been very good in fostering common voice, and I'm skeptical also for the future, given, for instance, the makeup of the next Polish government, how we can work together in finding common voice when it comes to Russia. I think there is a lot which has happened on the ground in terms of the eastern neighborhood between Russia and the Visegrad countries, and of course we all perceive the vital interest there. And I think it's important to also raise these issues and talk a bit more about them in political terms, which is not happening so much.
Thank you very much, Vladimír. So now we will take another set of questions. There was one question here, and then...
Thanks very much. I'm Roland Freudenstein from the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, which is the think tank of the European People's Party in Brussels. And I would like to politely disagree with Barbara's assessment about Russia having, Germany's attitude having strategically changed towards Russia. Yes, as a normative statement, I would 100% subscribe that, but I'm not sure that it's also a valid factual statement. Now, just take these 2 semantic beauties that are called common neighborhood and neighbors of neighbors. You know, Brussels is full of people who brandish these slogans as the future in the Eastern Partnership, which is part of the ENP. A common neighborhood is, of course, with Russia. And neighbors of neighbors might as well be in the singular. It's one neighbor of our neighbors that really counts. And, many people have good reason to look at neighbors of neighbors as a backdoor re-entry of a Russian droit de regard into things concerning the Eastern Partnership. Now, as I said, Brussels is full of people who are using these slogans, but some of them happen to be under the command of Mr. Steinmeier. And so, if I see how some German diplomats behave in Brussels, I wish they would listen more to you, Barbara, about this definite turn away from a Russia first attitude. And I think if it's definite, it really shouldn't come in through the back door.
Thank you for this comment. Ms. Řiháčková, please.
Thank you. I have two questions. My first question is how you scholars see the debate on current European neighbourhood policy vis-à-vis this prepared European global strategy. We in EAS are really working hard on seeing this global strategy coming, and all of we agree that ENP and neighbourhood policy is one of the key priorities. So what is the thinking and how you see European global strategy ENP issue? And my second remark, I've been struggling many years in my different capacities trying to support European values and principles in different Middle Eastern countries, I would put it this way. I would go straight back to Copenhagen criteria, which I think that basically, in my understanding, European neighbourhood policy is about introducing democracy, rule of law, human rights and equal economic chances in our neighbourhood. And rule of law. You all spoke about rule of law. We have seen at the beginning of this century a lot of troubles in this area, and I can speak about Egypt, I can speak about Syria, Libya, Lebanon, Jordan, Algeria. We don't need to name them all. And whenever we tried to a little bit bring something distant to benchmarking, like please do a little bit of progress here and there, well before Arab Spring, it was very difficult to sell it to European politicians, and it was of course very difficult to sell it to European bureaucrats. And I think that the crisis we have seen with Arab Spring is a crisis of justness. Arab population lacks justness. Trainings of police, trainings of penitentiary, increasing capacities and building capacities of judiciary and bringing up legislative reforms are absolute cornerstones from getting out of the crisis. And I have been lucky because in past years I can be responsible for EU Just Lex in Iraq and inherit the rule of law, key European Union position, training police, training Iraqi penitentiary, and training Iraqi justice in a marvelous way. And wherever we exported the same ideas to Jordan, to Lebanon, they are welcoming, they want to do it. How much you see that now we are slowly getting to understand the key need for principle building and strengthening capacities in the rule of law in all neighborhood countries, not only in the Middle Eastern ones. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions at the moment? No. Oh, there, one more. Irina, please.
I'm Marina Slovenko from Ukraine and Germany simultaneously. I have two half questions, half comments to the whole panel. The first is on Russia. I wonder if there is a strategy in the EU of dealing with Russia. I'm very grateful to the panelists who brought up this issue, because the view from the neighborhood countries, Eastern neighborhood, is such that unless Russia changes, there will be no peace and kind of stability in these countries, right? And the EU's policy towards Russia was based on the premise that Russia somehow is moving towards the West, is moving towards the Western standards, but there are some problems. But now I think we see that Russia is actually moving in the other direction. And if we look at Russia's defense or military strategy until 2020, it's really threatening. The way in which Russia is planning to increase its military capabilities. If we look how Russia uses energy politics, how Russia uses trade politics to undermine developments in neighborhood countries. So I wonder what would be the premise for development of such a strategy, and is there a vision in the EU how to deal with Russia, basically, with this long-term development which will be there for a long time, right? And the second question or comment is, there was a lot of debate within the ENP review process about differentiation among the countries, but I think there was too little debate about differentiation within the countries and among different actors within the countries. For instance, when Armenian president opted out of the association agreement, the EU's immediate reaction was, okay, we can accept it, despite the fact that there is still a society in Armenia, there are people in Armenia who do not agree with this decision of the president, right, which is not consulted by the society. And so the EU immediately agreed, okay, we'll work on the issues where Armenian government is comfortable to work and leave out the others. When Azerbaijan said we don't want the association agreement anymore, we want some kind of modernization strategy, EU also immediately agreed, okay, we'll work on that, despite the fact that there are more than 100 political prisoners in Azerbaijan, and there is still cooperation on energy going on. So I mean, I think the EU is lacking this capability of really looking at different actors in different countries and trying better to identify reform-minded actors and actors who block reforms and somehow try to enforce those who try to promote reforms in the long term. What kind of work could be done in this direction? I would like to hear your thinking as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irina. Vladimír, would you like to start to address some of the questions which were raised?
I'll take a couple of things. One is there was a question about the global strategy and what role for the neighborhood. I think certainly from this vantage point and this region, I think it's key that the neighborhood plays a key role in the global strategy. In terms of any EU foreign policy success, the neighborhood is absolutely crucial, and if we don't manage to get that point across in the strategy and also have some follow-up ideas in terms of specific policy lines, how to deal with it, then that strategy probably will not fly very high. The comments and the questions from Irina Solonenko on Russia and the diversity not only inside the EU but also across the neighbors, I think those are all excellent points. It seems that in terms of the recent dealings with Russia, of course, the key has been the EU unity. We've been able to achieve that EU unity in terms of how we address and kind of draw a certain red line when it comes to Russia, and that's been extremely difficult, but also extremely important that we've been able to sustain that. Now, as the immediate crisis in eastern Ukraine is getting less hot, of course, that EU unity is being again turn into some aspects of greater diversity and fragility in terms of how we approach and deal with Russia. And I think we have some interesting things coming up when it comes to the review of sanctions in coming weeks and actually coming months. And probably where we'll end up is on the one hand a combination of crisis management, which will still continue, and where the EU itself probably will play less of a role. It's been managed, after all, in the Normandy format by Germany, France, the key member states in the EU, but not so much the involvement of EU institutions. That's also interesting in itself in terms of the intra-EU diversity, how we deal with neighborhoods when it comes to crises. We tend to look for formats which don't involve institutions. And I guess it's also logical in terms of the nature and the degree of foreign policy. But that'll be the one approach. But at the same time, I guess there is going to be this kind of ambiguous managed confrontation with Russia, which will involve greater dialogue and also, I think, a greater willingness on the side of certain member states to relax, the sanctions and also to open up on other issues. And we've already seen that when it comes to very sensitive questions of policy making, for instance, in the area of energy. We've reopened a discussion on the routes for the future flow of natural gas, and of course Nord Stream 2 also opens up the question, for instance, of Germany's role in the overall EU's unity when it comes to the dealings with Russia. I think the issue when it comes to the initial question of global strategy, the issue of Russia, together with the immediate neighborhood, will also be key, and I expect that we'll have to revisit that and try to see what the policy line might be. But one of the things you outline, it's clear that Russia will not be part of this, current Russia will not be part of this neighborhood approach whereby we see this gradual convergence between the EU and Russia. That's off the cards and has been off the cards for some time, and I think the break with the war in Ukraine is quite clear. And I guess that's all the more reason why we also need to have dialogue with Russia to understand what Russia really wants in not only its neighborhood but also vis-a-vis the European Union. And in terms of the internal diversity and the actors in a country like Ukraine, I completely agree. This is crucial, and I think that also has to do with the degree to which the EU is present on the ground, and the member states are present on the ground. And that involves also areas which perhaps are under fire or have been under fire recently, as far as say Slaviansk, Kramatorsk. I'm not sure, things are happening there which would involve in any way any attempt to extend some of at least the ideas and goals of the neighborhood policy. There are no real actors from the EU side there, and I think this is also important in terms of engagement of the domestic internal actors. So I think we have a lot of work because Ukraine, of course, is extremely diverse as a country, which holds together to some extent barely, but also thanks to the diversity. So clearly regional presence and understanding of what's going on in the various parts of Ukraine will be crucial for any credible and workable specific neighborhood policy or Ukrainian policy on the side of the EU.
Thank you, Vladimír. Anthony, would you like to
So
comment?
I'm going to address the question of the place of rule of law, human rights, accountability in our relationship with the countries in the Middle East and North Africa. Of course, I completely share your view that these are, were a fundamental part of what the populations were asking for. Clearly, there were obviously demands to do with economic opportunity and social justice, but I think that, as a package, it all goes together. Governments that treat their populations with dignity and that are accountable to them are a vital interest of the populations in the region, and I think also a strong interest of the European Union. Not only a value, but an interest, because they are ultimately going to be the best foundation for stability and growth. But I think we have to be realistic about how far we can work to bring those goals about. There are some countries like Tunisia where we have partners that we can work with who are, I think, reasonably committed to the goal of reform in the judiciary and the security sector. And I think, a large part of consolidating democracy in Tunisia is precisely going to be those questions. And I hope that Europe will continue to push those issues with the governments there, because I think some parts of the society are probably more committed to that agenda than other parts. When we look at a country like Egypt, I think our calculation has to be somewhat different. I myself see absolutely no opportunity to work on these issues with Egypt as it now stands. I think any program of judicial reform or security sector reform that we mount, to me, is going to be fruitless. And because I think there simply is no commitment on the part of the Egyptian authorities to support these goals. And I don't see how, I don't think we have the leverage from outside to drive them forward. So therefore, my own view is that our relations with Egypt should be premised on the fact that this is a country which fundamentally does not share these values, that they're making assumptions which I think are counterproductive on their own terms. We can point that out. We can say that ultimately their approach is unlikely to bring the goals that they seek of stability and security. And I think we should deal with them on a basis that indicates our disagreement with the policies that they're pursuing. I don't think that we should cut off relations, but I think we should show that we have fundamental disagreements. So it's a policy perhaps of dealing with them on issues of mutual interest, but without doing so in a way that appears to endorse the approach that they've taken. And if I have a criticism of the way that European countries have handled Egypt in the last year, it's that they seem to, in the way that they received the Egyptian president, they seem to be kind of, to some degree, endorsing his rhetoric of normalization and democratization and legitimizing that. And therefore, I think it should be a more critical distance should be achieved. I wish I could be more positive about the degree to which we could work on judicial reform in Egypt, but I can't be, I'm afraid.
Maybe I take up on the question of EU global strategy and how it links to the ENP review. And now we have a special panel chaired by Antonio Misiroli on the global strategy. But maybe for outsiders, it is a bit surprising that the EU talks about a global strategy at a moment when it has so much trouble with its neighborhoods, and that this might be over ambitious. But nevertheless, I think even if we will stay in the mode of crisis for still some time, it is important to realize, of course, the European Union has global interests. And the EU still has the ambition to shape the rules also for other global issues, not in the least migration. We talked about that at length. So I think it is quite a good project to redraft the old security strategy, and ENP will be one, I think, core issue in it. And for ENP as such, I think this could be valuable because it's part of this reframing of ENP, and not just perceiving it and conducting it as some expansion of regulatory frameworks of the European Union to other neighboring countries only. What must become part of it is some strategic thinking about our interests, about our partners in the country, including civil societies, and how we can manage to also transmit our interests and in diplomatic ways respond to what the partners are offering. And I think the test ground for it will be now the implementation, at least of the 3 association DCFTA we have. They will enter into force at the beginning of next year. I think one should also use this as some sort of political demonstration. But then I think because it is maximum idea of convergence with EU standards written into these agreements, I think then we have to enter into very intensive dialogues with governments and the other players involved, what we can really do and come up with more realistic, I would say, roadmaps for implementation, also with a view of that there will be some benefits, at least in the medium term, for the citizens. You talked about ownership. They must see that there are some effects on the ground, that it's worthwhile to enter into this kind of approximation. It's not only a legal thing. You have to take with you a lot of other actors, and that is why this must really be an, let's say, effort that is not only directed to the elites. This is also something we learned from the enlargement process, and we then have to step by step follow it. So I think it will be of some value being part of also the global strategy of the EU for ENP. And I leave the other questions to you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I was going to go back to rule of law as well, if with a lot of agreement with what was said already, but just slightly different perspective. If you go back to the beginning of the Arab Spring in January, February 2011, citizens in the streets of Tunis and Cairo were calling for justice, accountability, liberties, rights, dignity. At first sight, for people my generation, and given my role back then, you'd say these people are reading the Barcelona Declaration of 1995, if you were a bit naive. Then, when the first elections came out in Tunisia and Egypt, Islamists came to power, Ennahda and the Muslim Brotherhood, with a very different narrative and a very large distance with EU values. Think of women's rights, for example. Huge difference. What was important subsequently is that, of course, in some countries, Libya or Syria, it turned into chaos, but there was a rebalancing in both Tunisia and Egypt. Tunisia is perhaps the only model that we still understand, where the civil society has fought very hard to craft the constitution, defending women's rights, defending quite a number of things that we would approve here in the EU. Slightly different, of course, or a lot different in Egypt. So there, the hopeful element is the civil society and institution building, to the extent that governments would let us do that. They would certainly do that in Tunisia. We're not too sure about Egypt. We're not too sure anymore about Turkey. The big but is that we should not underestimate how EU values and principles are running counter to domestic political interests. We see that in Turkey right now. We see that in Egypt, obviously. You have an illiberal democratic model being built, and we tend to cooperate there in the name of stability, refugees, in the case of Turkey, and so on. So we're going to have this constant fight between realpolitik and values.
Thank you very much, Marc. Unfortunately, our time is up, but I think this debate set perfectly the stage for the breakout sessions, which start at 11:15. And let me inform you that the session A will be placed here in this room. The session B on Daesh will be in Charco Bridge Saloon, which is in the ground floor, and the session C will be held in the concert hall. So thank you very much. Please let me give the round of applause to our speakers for their excellent contributions.